Work in the vegetable gardens is, by its very nature, quite seasonal. Or at least it is for those of us who grow food in parts of the world where there are definite seasons. And the amount of work that you need to do, or in some cases can do, relates to the type of seasonal changes you can get. Some places are far too cold in the winter to grow anything, and other places get too hot in the summer for anything to really grow. Here in Ireland, the winters are relatively warm enough to be able to continue to harvest from the gardens, especially with the help of polytunnels. But the days are short, and it is often too rainy to really do anything productive outside. Our busiest times of year in the gardens tends to be during the long temperate days of the summer, but it really depends on how we manage the gardens, what types of crops we are growing, and how much work we are able or willing to put in. We try to keep track of all the time that we spend in each of the gardens, separating out the type of tasks. But this is not so accurate or consistent, and I'm always hesitant to use this kind of data for comparisons. In gardens like this, there are so many different variables, and when measuring time, we're adding even more. Both Chris and I work in these gardens, often at different times, and we naturally work at different speeds, and each of us works faster or slower depending on how much energy we have that day, or how much of a rush we are in. And there are probably quite a few tasks that we forget to record, and other times when we forget to account for distractions while we were working. And when we are working in the gardens, we rarely work on only one type of tasks, often doing spot weeding while harvesting or extra watering while planting. It is also difficult to account for the time spent outside of the garden. For example, the amount of time that we spend collecting organic material and managing, turning, and sieving the compost for use in some gardens, compared to the gardens where we simply use compost that I buy in. So there are a lot of qualifications and potential issues with using time to compare the gardens, and I'm hesitant to focus on any of the details, but there are some general trends that I think are interesting and useful to look at. We have been better, or perhaps more consistent, with keeping track of things while managing the family scale gardens, at least compared to the larger spaces of the black plot that are undergoing a lot of development. And if I add up all the hours spent each month in 2022 in these 6 gardens, a general trend is obvious. The amount of time spent in the gardens increases during the spring to a peak in May, with another peak in August before dropping in the autumn. Dividing this down to more relatable numbers, we spent an average of 2.5 to 3 hours per week for the 6 months from April through to August, managing each of the 6 gardens. We worked a bit less on average in March and September, and closer to 1 hour a week from October and through the winter to February. This is an average between the 6 gardens, which hides a lot of variability, and assumes that the work was spread evenly over all the weeks in a month, which rarely happens. But I think it's interesting how little time is needed to manage 100 square meter growing spaces like this, especially when each garden produced more than 400 kilograms of vegetables in the year, with some of them producing quite a bit more. It is important to note that all these gardens have been established for quite a few years, so it does not include the extra work of setting up a growing space, and we generally know what we're doing. And it was also a fairly good growing season last year, with no significant crop losses. But we could also have done a lot more with some of the gardens, especially later in the season. Looking at the different types of tasks that we keep track of, there are obvious differences in what we spend our time doing at different times of the year. There was a lot more bed preparation earlier in the season. There was more focus on sowing and transplanting crops in the spring and early summer. Weeding was a task throughout the year, with significantly more in the spring when the weed seeds germinated and before the crops were established. There was a fair amount of time focused on watering during the dry spells of the summer months. General care of the crops seemed to peak in early summer, and a lot of time spent harvesting in the spring, and even more in the summer and late autumn. And the busiest times of the year was when there was a lot more time spent on a few key tasks. All this makes sense and is what I would expect. But I think it's interesting to see how this changes with the different approaches and issues with each of the 6 gardens that are included. In the extensive garden, all the digging and fertilizing the beds took place in the spring, as did the first wave of sowing and transplanting crops. But there was a second wave in July as the early crops were finished and the second crop of the season went in. And most of the harvesting was from June to September, but this is reflected in the planting plans of this garden, which focused on the medium and long season plants. We did not grow a lot of the fast-growing root and leaf crops in this garden, and focused more on the crops that are in the ground for at least a few months. In some cases we did fit 2 crops into the same space in the season, but in many parts of the garden we only had 1 crop growing in the year, accepting that there would be a fair amount of empty soil for a lot of the year. This strategy required a fair amount of work in March, April, and May, preparing the beds and getting the plants into the ground, and then a lot of work harvesting in the summer and autumn. For 5 months of the year, we spent on average only about 10 hours a month doing all the tasks in this garden. But for another 5 months of autumn and winter, this was closer to 2 hours a month on average. But we did set this garden up to be easier to manage than some of the others. There was a lot more work in the intensive garden, and we were busy at quite different times of the year. We spent a lot of time double digging all of the beds in January, March, and May, when the weather and the empty beds made this possible. But from this year onwards, we are going to stop doing this labor-intensive task. There was also a lot more sowing of crops earlier in the season, and a lot more time sowing and transplanting in general, mainly because we grew a succession of plantings of the quick rotation crops. These multiple sowings of small batches of lettuce, salad greens, and other fast-growing crops took a lot of time to sow and also a lot of time to harvest. And it was these tasks related to the quick crops and the time-intensive bed preparation method that really differentiated the intensive garden from the extensive garden, with a lot more work at different times of the year. This garden took twice as long to manage as the extensive garden, but it also produced 200 kilograms more vegetables, with a lot of this increase being high-value salad crops. The timing of when we worked in the no-dig garden was very different, especially with the huge amount of time spent digging the beds in the intensive garden being replaced with the shorter task of hauling and spreading compost. I also didn't get the planting plan sorted for this garden until later in the spring, so there wasn't the same focus on sowing and transplanting the diverse range of salad and other quick crops in the spring. But this showed up with lots of sowing in May, June, and July, and a lot to harvest from July through to September. As with all the other gardens, I ran out of steam later in the season and didn't get around to sowing a lot of the crops and green manures that I had hoped to get into the ground for overwinter growing and harvesting. And this led to lots of empty spaces in the gardens, less to harvest and eat over the winter and into the spring, and the reduced amount of work at the end of the year. The amount of hours that we put in each month to manage the polyculture garden was more consistent from February through to September. This started with a fair amount of work to fertilize and cultivate a few of the empty beds, but this task continued during the season whenever we replanted the clusters within the mixed planting. And this was an example of when it is hard to separate out the different tasks in our time tracking, as the bed preparation tasks were often done while sowing and transplanting, which we did fairly consistently for about 8 months. The weeding, watering, and general care for the beds and crops was definitely higher in the spring and summer months, and there was an extended period of harvest. Similar to the intensive garden, we sowed a lot of the faster growing crops in this polyculture garden. But as the weather cooled down in the autumn and winter, even the cold tolerant plants slowed down and there was less to harvest. I still have a lot to learn about how to manage this type of interplanted garden, as it took a fair amount of time but didn't produce as much to harvest as the others. The polyculture garden was set up to explore the possible benefits of a more complicated interplanting of crops, which for us ends up taking more time. With the simple garden, on the other hand, the crop rotation and management strategies were developed specifically to reduce the amount of work needed. And we spent only 36 hours in this garden and still produced a lot of food, mainly because we only grew 4 main crops that are relatively easy to manage, or at least don't have all the regular harvesting that so many of the crops in the other gardens require. The work preparing beds and sowing or planting the crops was mainly in the spring, with most of the work occurring in May when the potato bed was dug and planted. This was also when weeding and care for the crops was most time-consuming, including thinning the carrot crop. And most of the harvesting was in November, though it probably would have been better to do this work in October. This left a very different profile of when we worked in this garden, with most of it in the spring when the enthusiasm for work in the gardens is at its highest, and then harvesting in the autumn. And if I was the kind of person who liked to take long summer vacations, then this simple garden would be the only one to thrive in my absence. The workload throughout the year in the Polytunnel Garden followed a similar pattern to the intensive and polyculture gardens outside. But the work preparing beds and sowing crops started earlier within the protected growing space, with a lot to harvest in the late spring and early summer. And for the summer and autumn, this garden was mostly filled with long-season, heat-loving plants like beans and tomatoes that took a lot of time to manage and harvest. The biggest change in this garden in recent years has been replacing the time-consuming hand watering with sprinklers and drip lines for most of the watering, which has drastically reduced the number of hours needed to keep the plants in this polytunnel happy and productive. But this garden still took more than 10 hours a month to manage for most of the year, and over 20 hours during the periods of most harvesting. If we had kept up with the planting plans, this workload would have continued into the winter with a lot more to care for and harvest. A bigger harvest over a longer period of time is one of the main potential benefits of a protected growing space like this, but this requires us to put in the time, often when we are already busy. This polytunnel garden produced a lot more food than any of the outside gardens, but it didn't take more time than the intensive garden, which really highlights the labor-intensive soil preparation practices we have been using in that garden. It seems like a fairly obvious thing to say, but the more time you put into a vegetable garden, the more you'll be able to get out of it. Of course, we can manage some things so that there are a lot less work, but even with a big yield from relatively little work in the simple garden, we need to accept a significantly reduced diversity of what we are able to eat. We also have changing levels of enthusiasm for work in the gardens at different times of the year. And the time that we spend doing some tasks often means that other things don't get the attention that they need. And I think it's interesting to look at all this data with this in mind. It is easy to see the focus enthusiasm of the spring in these graphs and the need to get the beds ready and so many crops in the ground. And then the amount of time spent harvesting in the summer, especially with frequent harvesting of the salad and fruiting crops, meant that we didn't have so much time available for sowing following crops or managing the existing crops better. And this led to fewer crops and less work in the autumn, and also a bit of frustration with not being able to keep up with the planting plans. And then I abandoned a lot of the other plans for the rest of the year. So when I look at the rise and fall of the amount of time we spend in these gardens at different months of the year, I see a few key opportunities for reducing the workload. But I also see how the amount of time that we have to spend can be one of the limiting resources in the gardens, and that this scarcity can have a significant knock-on effect for later in the season. Of course, the reduced workload for part of the season is definitely due to shorter days and less growth. But it's also because we were not able to spend the time earlier in the year or at the end of the previous year preparing things. And this is something that I'm trying to keep in mind as I prepare the planting plans for the coming growing season.